Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to WSP's Net Zero webinar on managing carbon and infrastructure. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Monica Richter. I work at WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, Australia in the Climate and Energy Program, and I'm also a project director for MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. I'm delighted to be here as your facilitator today. I'm joined by panelists Catherine Eamon, Lewis Barlow, Nick Gallagher, and Evan Smith, who I'll formally introduce in a moment. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are all on Aboriginal country. I'm coming to you from Wandamooka country today, south of Brisbane, near the Moreton Bay. And as we are all on traditional owner land, we'd like to acknowledge their continuing connection to culture, communities, land, sea and sky. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and we're joining from right across Australia on today. So a bit of housekeeping. So as part of today's webinar, it will be an interactive discussion. So please, we have received some of your fantastic questions as you registered, but do continue to put them through onto the Q&A button. And your cameras and microphones are off, but your active participation is encouraged. We will be having a poll very shortly, so you'll be able to submit those responses, because really we want to see where are you at on your decarbonisation journey, and any questions that we don't get to, perhaps we'll make some attempt to try and answer those at the end of it, and then everyone will receive a copy of the recording as well. Okay, so let's start our webinar. So I'd like to formally introduce the presenters for today. So Catherine Eamon, who is the Regional Origination and Engineering Manager at Acciona, with lots of experience in building infrastructure. Evan Smith, who's the National Sustainability Manager, Sustainable Construction for Holcim Australia, and also a co-chair for the Concrete Cement Working Group for MECLA. Lewis Barlow is the Head of Profession Decarbonisation, Sustainability, Climate Change for WSP, coming from the UK, and it's now 5 a.m. in the morning, and I hear, Lewis, that you've had 2 shots of Red Bull. So I think we're going to have a very good session with you today. And finally, Nick Gallagher, who's the Associate Principal Economist for WSP Australia. So you've got those notes in the chat, more details about who they are. So really, what if we had, I know the UK has done this, a finite carbon budget for infrastructure projects. The UK is ahead of Australia on these issues, and it's very interesting to see what progress is being made. So we're going to talk today about PAS 2080. It's a global standard for measuring carbon and infrastructure, guiding organisations on reducing carbon emissions during the planning, design, construction, operation phases of infrastructure. And for Australian firms who are looking to adopt PAS 2080, it will help to integrate carbon reduction into decision-making processes while aligning with national reduction goals and other international sustainability frameworks. And I guess the question is, why is this important? And one of the key drivers at the moment, from 1 January next year, companies will be required to be mandatory reporting on their decarbonisation transition pathways as part of their obligations to ASIC. And so, companies, governments, entities are going to have to start preparing governance and sustainability processes and those transition processes. So this is one way for infrastructure firms and other companies to be thinking about how they go about defining and measuring and decarbonising their businesses. So let's get that poll underway. Let's see where our audience is up to. So the question is, and you can have more than one question, where are you on your decarbonisation process? Not started, establishing targets, measuring your baseline, developing a roadmap, implementing initiatives, getting started, monitoring and reporting, or not sure. So we'll give you a minute to get those results in. and then we'll have a bit of a sense where you're up to on your journey to date. And, you know, there might be different projects depending on where you are in the construction pipeline, what profession you're in.
I think the other thing worth noting, Monica, is it's not just private sector companies having these sort of requirements. It's now sort of public sector as well, starting to introduce some of these requirements around PAS 2080 or reporting requirements for emissions across the infrastructure lifecycle.
Absolutely. The environmental sustainability policy that was introduced by the federal government earlier this year, requiring measurement around embodied carbon and reductions in emissions, is certainly something that is driving that interest. We're starting to see that within the MECLA membership as well, from both government and the private sector. All right, so how are we going with that poll? Have we got some responses to that yet? We've got 200 people online, so hoping we'll have about 200 responses. So let's just see what happens. So we can't see that coming through. Maybe Lewis, a question. Oh, there we go. So the majority of people are developing a roadmap, very good, and implementing initiatives, getting started on that. There's a number on that: monitoring and reporting, measuring baseline, establishing targets, and not started. So if the majority are not in the net not started, that's very good. I think that's a really good indication of where the industry is at as well. So quite down the path there. Does anyone want to make any comments on those observations? Maybe a question for you, Lewis, you know, in terms of where the UK profession is up to, do you see those results different to the results that might take place in the UK?
Firstly, good morning and good afternoon or evening, wherever we are. Nice to meet you, Monica. Thanks for asking me on. Yeah, I'm based in Edinburgh, by the way, so hello from Scotland. I think, yeah, that seems like broadly there's a distribution here in the UK, but there's probably a little bit of a greater uptake because it's not mandated here yet, PAS 2080, but it's on its way. And the Department for Transport, the UK Department for Transport, has mandated it, and that's got a massive supply chain, including rail and road and all sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's similar. I recognize that pattern. There's still a long way to go, you know, but we're on the way.
Okay, so mandated the requirement to use PAS 2080 in Department of Transport for infrastructure.
Department of Transport, that's
Wow.
right, and they gave a leading time as well. So the government wrote to all the arm's length bodies 2 years ago and said, right, you've got 2 years to get your act together and mandate PAS 2080, and it's sort of working its way through the supply chain at the moment.
Okay, yes, I bet that's a big challenge. So our first question, it's for all of the panelists. In one sentence, what in your view is the biggest challenge organisations face with regard to carbon measurement and reporting? And Evan, I might start with you.
Okay, thanks, Monica. Yeah, I think really it is the supply chain. Like we've done EPDs for about 6 years now, and it's like initially for it's like, oh great, we've disclosed the impact of our concrete. Customers want low carbon solutions. Job's kind of done, can kind of walk away and retire. But it's really like a complex kind of beast. I guess it's like really the knowledge. Like people are like, well, what's an EPD? How do we use it? Like, what are the numbers? Okay, what do we compare it to next? Oh, how do we ask for it? And it's just like continued on, or it's like, oh, we tried that type of lower carbon material 20 years ago, or you know, the procurement models, are they set up? So I think it's really solutions do exist now at the moment. Like governments want it and drive it. I think it's really the complex like supply chain between that is like to kind of get success, I think, and uptake the lower carbon materials.
All right, that's good to hear. So Catherine, what in your opinion is sort of some of the greatest challenges?
Hi everyone. I guess for a company like ours, Acciona, and related to major projects, one of the biggest challenge we faced was the large amount of data and how they need to be captured, because we have many systems. I'm thinking about project control systems where we report and monitor costs and things like that. And carbon management should sit at the same level, but it comes with, as Evan was saying, there's the link with the supply chain, which means the number of data is massive. So having the right system in place and expanding our current systems to be able to handle this large amount of data, getting the reporting and then maintaining the accuracy is probably the challenge we are facing. I would just add another one. I know you said one sentence, but I say two sentences and two challenges. The culture and the leadership is critical because people will, they will do it, they will chip in if they see the value of it and if they see that this is something that is being considered as critical by their management line.
Absolutely spot on. So the digital piece, the data management piece, but also that softens the leadership from the top driving that expectation there. And Nick, what about yourself?
Hey, yeah, so as an economist, I primarily work sort of in the public infrastructure space, and the most significant challenge I see is often early in the project lifecycle, where the scope of a project is often largely undefined. So it can be very challenging to estimate whole of life carbon emissions for competing options. And to do so would require quite a lot of historical benchmark data, which agencies and industry just generally don't have yet. And this is the part of the infrastructure lifecycle where you can make the biggest difference. So having that information is really critical up front.
All right. And Lewis, sort of reflecting on those comments, what would you say are those biggest challenges, and maybe sort of reflect on how the UK has maybe overcome some of them?
I recognize all of them and I agree with all of them. I think probably the most fundamental thing, if you boil it all down, is needing to level the playing field and making sure that clients ask the right questions. It's still here in the UK, there's inconsistency in what's being asked. So that leads to a need for clarity in procurement and contracts and whole life carbon, which has already been mentioned. So that's the kind of underpinning principle of PAS 2080. It's looking at the overall picture, the overall impact. Whole life carbon is non-negotiable. So you almost don't really need to know the intricacies of carbon accounting. I mean, this is something that the experts can sort of fill in the gaps about. But as a client, if you just mandate PAS 2080, all this will take care of itself. So there's a lot of problems there. But the key, as Catherine said, I think, is leadership, which is central to PAS 2080. And I could tell you a bit about the UK situation if you like. So I have to say I have a vested interest in PAS 2080 because I was involved in editing the first one in 2016, and I was on the technical advisory panel and steering group for the latest one in 2023. So I have a PAS 2080 tattoo somewhere. I can't really show you; it's not appropriate. But it's the key to net zero. I've come to really realize, because it's not just about decarbonizing the concrete or the steel on your project. At a higher level, it's about choosing the right project, and it's about lining it up and joining the dots between project selection and national net zero targets. And then when you get your head around that, it's really powerful. So it is being mandated more frequently and more consistently by higher and higher level organizations, including public sector and private sector. And as I said before, because whole life carbon is at the center of it, it's I feel a relief for professionals not to have to rely on the environmental impact assessment process, which I think is sort of similar in Australia, in that you've got the EIA process,
yes,
which may have been the fallback, excuse me, up until now. If you're saying, how do we deal with carbon in our infrastructure projects? You might think, oh, well, we have an environmental assessment process, but that usually only kicks in at a certain level. And even when it kicks in, well, speaking on the behalf of the UK, it's fairly toothless, and very inconsistent, very subjective. So now with PAS 2080, you don't have to rely on that process. There's a central mechanism to manage whole life carbon.
Okay, great. Good insight, something for us to reflect on here in Australia as it marches down the path. So we're going to move to the topic of carbon baselining and measurement. So before organisations begin to reduce their carbon, of course, they need to put the right systems in place to measure their emissions. So, Catherine, we talked a bit about some of those challenges. Maybe you could, to talk a bit further about carbon forecasting and measurement and what some of the opportunities are in that space as well.
Well, I think Lewis mentioned the baselining of projects. So having a clear directive, and actually the Infrastructure New South Wales has done a good piece of work in that space by their policy about decarbonising infrastructure delivery. So hopefully that will give a clear baseline and guidance, and it would be great to see this policy expanded to the other states, which then avoids the risk of interpretation, too many standards, too many tools. I mean, we go back to the past 2080 element, which will suppress this first step. So I think that's probably really the key opportunity we can see. The other opportunity we can discuss is the impact period. So, and again, it's important to talk about the all of life of projects. So as a delivery arm, as a contractor, I'm not going to say we don't have any impact, because we do have an impact, but this is a limited impact. The most impactful period happens at the start and throughout, with working with design houses. So this will help if we put more effort up front, like a good system engineers would say, then we can maximize the impact. So there's an element of collaboration there, making sure that organizations don't deliver this matching to a baseline, whatever we call it, in isolation, but work together to really calibrate the carbon budget, and then this can be managed and reported throughout the life cycle of the asset.
So having clients who have some good insight and willing to work with you and the design studios to drive that upfront decarbonisation through the design specifications is one big opportunity that's left to take options. So Evan, as a sustainability manager, what's important? What do you consider important in baselining and measuring carbon on infrastructure projects? How do you go about doing that, and what do you prioritise?
Yeah, so I guess I'm right at the coal phase. So like we supply ready-mix concrete, so very much at like the materials, thinking in like the measurements side of things. And I guess probably there's two parts to that question. I think there's measurement. So I mean, measurement can happen across the the life cycle of the project. So I'm kind of down at the pointy end where it's like EPDs, actual concrete that was used, actual kind of emissions, and the life cycle model that gets built up for then the transport and the installation of it. And then I guess you go up the supply chain, it just depends on like what level of certainty you kind of have. If you have tender phase, you might not necessarily know what type of concrete or the mixes you're using. So you might be using generic factors. And as you kind of move up the life cycle stages more, you might kind of be like, oh, how much concrete do we think we use? You might be using like economic numbers of like, oh, we think we're going to spend like $2 million on concrete. So I guess the level of certainty kind of sharpens as you go through it. We've just heard kind of before about the greatest opportunity, I think, for like the reduction up front was like the design phase. So I think that's like the measurement. I really see that as kind of one thing, like what are the actual emissions? They don't change. I think the complex part is like the baseline, like what are you comparing it to is the $1 million question for everything as well. And that's really like the level of reduction. But I guess I like to kind of simplify it as like the measurement is the actual emissions that are going out. So I mean, by 2050, they need to be zero. So by then hopefully the baseline fall away, but the baseline kind of helps us kind of track like how are we tracking on our road to reduction as well.
All right, so we've heard a lot about the PAS 2080 and why it's a good framework, but we also have had a lot of questions come in, and please, if you have some questions, that please put them into the Q&A. How does it differ to other carbon management standards? I think that would be a really interesting one to explore. I mean, certainly in MECLA we have a measurement working group, And the first output of that working group was a discussion paper looking at, the benchmarking standards, measurement methods, quantification methods, and subsequently we've seen both Transport for New South Wales put out yesterday their carbon engineering cost library, which was fantastic to see. And neighbours, of course, are working on their own emissions program, and there's harmonisation between both of those entities. But so how can you integrate the PAS 2080 framework into the IS Infrastructure Sustainability Council, Green Star? Those are some of the questions that have come up. So Lewis, maybe over to you first, if you could give us some thoughts on that.
I'm pretty sure that PAS 2080 is compatible with everything, really. And the way to think about it is that it's a sort of umbrella approach that sits above everything. And it's probably worth mentioning the very simple process of PAS 2080. So it's 3 steps, basically. There's baselining. So it's baselining whole life carbon emissions from the earliest stage possible for the reasons that have already been mentioned. That's when you can make the most impact. So it's baselining, then setting reduction targets, then proactively managing it across the supply chain. And that's it. And any standard or variable, sustainability certificate that you want can sort of fit underneath that. Just a quick note on baselining as well. In the UK, I think we're maybe past this, but not quite. There's always a bit of a worry that people will artificially inflate baselines to make it easier to point out that you've done better, because you go, oh, look how we've saved 20%, 30%. Baselining should be your business as usual. So it's just kind of stands to reason. What would we normally do? And then we try and improve it from there. Yeah.
Okay. And so Nick, what have you seen in terms of any differences between the application of the PAS 2080 and some of the existing standards that are used here in Australia?
I think the thing that PAS 2080 probably does well is it provides a breakdown of the responsibilities across the value chain. So whether or not you're an asset owner, a manager, you're a designer, constructor, product and material supplier, sort of delineates the roles and responsibilities of carbon reduction across those different groups. Whereas some of the other tools probably don't quite sit at that level. They're often a bit more detailed and used on specific components or stages of the project lifecycle. So I think it's a bit more sort of holistic and sort of sits at a more principled level.
Okay. And Evan, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add to that in terms of your experience working with the IS, for example, the rating schemes?
Yeah, so I guess both IS, Green Star, and Neighbours, incentivize good data was EPDs. The reduction in embodied carbon is driven. And I think, and also I'd say focusing on the high impact materials. So, for roads, it's typically asphalt, number one, then concrete and steel. For buildings, typically concrete, steel, glass. And then also, I guess, more wider for councils and state governments as well. I guess scope 3 is typically one of the more harder ones, but it's typically 80 to 90% of it. I think they normally kind of focus with their evolution on their diesel and electricity consumption, the scope 1 and 2, and then I think they turn their attention for the harder one and go, oh wow, actually that's quite a large thing. So I think by the sounds of it, there's broad kind of focus. We're all aimed at kind of measuring life cycle thinking, make sure we're kind of actually reducing carbon and quantifying it as well. So I think there's a lot of alignment, but there's always going to be the subtle nuances for each of the different rating schemes, because one's targeted to infrastructure or buildings or likewise. Yeah.
Okay, so some different complex differences, but each of them are compatible. That's really the message that I'm
Monica,
getting.
could I maybe add just a thing there? Sorry. The other thing about PAS 2080 and why it's applicable to everything, it doesn't include any limits in it. So it doesn't say you have to have a carbon intensity of 600 kilograms per meter squared or anything like that. You fit in your own national or local targets and limits into that framework. I could answer. There's a question in the chat that's interesting. I could answer just while I've got the mic, if that's all right. Someone says, at the moment we're calculating embodied emissions for major projects more than $100 million. What about projects up to that level and minor projects?
Yes.
major and minor, all those sort of things. So the PAS 2080 answer would be, well, you have to, you know, it's kind of non-negotiable, but that's easy to say. There isn't a sort of threshold above which you must calculate embodied carbon in the UK, but I kind of predict that's coming. Without going down too much of a rabbit hole, the buildings world, so we're talking mainly about infrastructure, but the latest PAS 2080 covers buildings and infrastructure. The buildings world in the UK and the EU is moving towards a threshold of about, in broad terms, 10 dwellings, or if you sort of calculate it roughly, it's about 1,000 tons of carbon. And I'm roughly paraphrasing, if you're below around about that size of development, it may be arguable that you don't have to bother calculating embodied carbon. But that's the sort of level at which you really ought to start calculating it. So I think, you know, from my personal opinion, the $100 million kind of threshold is far too high, just in my opinion. And also, finally, one thing while I got Mike, Catherine's already mentioned it, but the Infrastructure New South Wales the New South Wales government decarbonising infrastructure policy and the associated embodied carbon guidance, and Rachel's put the link in the chat there, is absolutely brilliant. And it really takes PAS 2080 to the next level and explains a lot in detail. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that.
Yep, thank you, Lewis. No, it is a very good document. They've done some fantastic work there. So Nick, a question for you as we move to the next topic. So you've had significant experience advising, you know, reduction targets, carbon measurement frameworks. Can you talk about what it takes to integrate reductions into infrastructure project life cycles, please?
Yeah, so I think firstly, we need to see those sort of targets and policy flow through into sort of project requirements, guidelines, templates, that sort of thing, particularly for government. So this would include requirements to measure emissions across the whole project life cycle. In the work I do, which is mostly in the upfront planning, particularly some requirements around valuing and measuring carbon in business cases and economic assessments. And we've seen this sort of become a bit more common lately. So Infrastructure Australia's Guide to Greenhouse Gas Emissions sort of came out earlier this year, sort of sets out a number of requirements to measure and value emissions in economic assessments and business cases. And in the past, carbon impact of these large significant infrastructure projects has often been ignored. Like the key focus has been on, you know, the other benefits and costs, and carbon has often never quite been assessed. So I think when undertaking these assessments, incorporating carbon and valuing it is so important, because often these carbon reduction components come at an increased cost, and we need a mechanism to assess what the value of that cost is to society. So similarly, so Infrastructure Australia also released some work lately on a national carbon value. So that helps you do that. So what it essentially does is says, what's the benefit to society of reducing 1 ton of emissions? And the values that they put out range between about $56 in 2024 to about $370 in 2050. We've also seen like New South Wales Treasury come out with similar values, and also the AER for the energy sector also came out with some emissions values as well. So these have been very critical, and in some of the assessments that we've been doing, it makes the difference between these projects, these decarbonisation projects, not stacking up and not being viable and not getting government investment, to actually being viable and going through and securing funding. So whether or not it's like a decarb focused project, or whether or not you're just trying to justify, you know, certain design tweaks, certain low carbon materials, you know, having this mechanism to actually value those emissions is super important. And then in the private sector, you know, you can't use the same carbon values, but you could potentially, you know, compare against something like the cost of offsets. If you were going to try to reach your net zero targets, what's the alternate value there? So I think that's probably some of the key lessons.
Great. And so it's time, cost, quality, and carbon as the key component measurements. And where, I guess, you know, I like to use the analogy, you know, safety wasn't kind of the level playing field for businesses, you know, 15, 20 years ago, and now it is. You know, everybody is very, and so carbon needs to be that level playing field as well. So if we talk, you mentioned carbon offsets, Catherine, a question for you. Acciona you've got an interesting global approach on carbon reduction using carbon credits. Can you talk us through what you've learnt from this approach, please?
Yes, and I will put a bit of a disclosure, a disclaimer on this. I may say things that are engaging only myself. So, because this is an ongoing conversation in the business. So Acciona has been carbon neutral through carbon offsets since 2016. And through their growth, especially in Australia, by doing this external growth, I'm just providing a bit of context. The company, with acquiring a large fleet of vehicle, identified that they weren't carbon neutral anymore. So one of the approach that's been taken was to put in place a mapping of the European taxonomy back to Australia, which means the Australian business pays a tax to the overall business to compensate. It's some sort of a financial offset to compensate our generation of carbon in our business. But what happens then? This money gets back to us for funding some decarbonization innovations. The intent is not to use offsets. The intent is to generally reduce, which is probably the point I wanted to make. So we can see carbon offset as a transitioning system to support businesses to establish this leadership, the understanding of, because it has a financial impact eventually. So having a first step with using this sort of offset to establish the leadership, to put, as Nick was saying, carbon as the same level as other metrics we use to monitor the efficiency and the success of a project is a possible step. But then this is what I call the transition, which is we still need to look at reducing and innovating for proper decarbonization. So for example, I mean, we do have some targets, back to what Lewis was saying, baseline targets, and then implementing, we do have mandatory targets internally in our project to cut the water reduction with some minimum requirements for fuel. And of course, this helps, it more than helps when these targets are being set by clients and that these targets are coming with incentives.
Yes, great. Well, you know, I know that the whole carbon credit, it's a complex area that would require a whole new different webinar to talk about how to do that. It sounds like the business Acciona it's like an insetting program with those incentives in place to drive decarbonisation within the business, but you know, doing it within the business itself rather than sort of offshoring it somewhere is probably a wise thing. So, Evan, a question for you. You know, low carbon materials like concrete are key in achieving decarbonisation goals. What's your experience in how firms are starting to approach this? What's good practice?
Yeah, thanks
In other
for
words,
that, Monica. And before I get onto that, actually, I did a site tour of it was Acciona of Western Sydney Harbour Tunnel project last week, and it was very cool. Actually, it had fully electric utility vehicles. I've never seen that in Australia yet, so I think that was like one of the incentives that's kind of coming through driven from that kind of corporate policy that we've heard of. So yeah, and I've heard that was like one of the last things to kind of crack. They always like a utility is kind of like one of those last frontiers, I think, for a fully electric vehicle. So I was pretty impressed with that. Yeah, so there was a fleet of them parked in the basement charging up. So hats off to you, Catherine. Yeah, going back to it, and it probably ties in, I think, of like what we were kind of discussing before about like setting kind of targets and that whole kind of supply chain. I think probably tying into past that, I think a really great example for the infrastructure project is like a major infrastructure project that we're working on, our metro tunnel. The government actually set like an embodied carbon reduction target. So I guess that was outside of like the rating system, that under a rating as well, but they actually said, we want you to say do like a 36% reduction in embodied carbon. And the contractor, because they actually saw that this was valued by the client, they actually kind of bid back and go, well, actually, we'll give you like a 45% reduction as part of trying to win the work because we see that you value this. So they end up winning the work, and they're like, yeah, we'll take you up on that. At the moment, they're actually on track for, I think, like a 50% reduction in the embodied carbon. Yeah, sorry, and this is specifically for concrete I'm talking to, but I just thought that was a really cool example. Like, if you're setting the signals that this is important to you, setting targets kind of, above the rating schemes as well, that this is a priority that you as a client are interested in and focused on, then you can drive the demand all the way through to the supply chain. So got countless examples of that happening across Australia. You'd be sitting in a meeting with a procurement manager and they're like, can you give us an EPD for your concrete? Can you do like a 40% reduction in body carbon, compared to projects that might be under rating schemes, but they're just kind of, they might not focus on it because it's not the cheapest way to kind of do it, or it's not been as a priority flag to them as well. So they might not even ask about it. They're like, oh, we'll just use the normal concrete we'll already use. So really, I think it's, I guess, the takeaway, it's above the rating schemes I've seen. It's really the clients kind of driving. So hopefully the PAS 2080 can kind of really drive that and equip kind of clients with like setting this as a priority, and it can come away through the supply chain. So we're having similar conversations as well.
Yeah, that target setting is really fundamental. Okay, so some learnings from Australia and the globe. So Nick, what are some of the key learnings where you've been advising New South Wales, Victorian government on how their policies, guidelines, frameworks can be updated to incorporate carbon emissions? Are we talking about carbon budgets yet in Australia for projects? Where are things up to?
Not quite up to carbon budgets yet,
No.
unfortunately. But yeah, there's been quite a lot of good work here, and yeah, with the work we've been doing with New South Wales government, Infrastructure Victoria as well, I think a key central theme into successfully getting government agencies to include carbon in the decision-making processes has really been about leadership, and we've heard it before. In the projects where there hasn't been strong top-down direction from leaders in government agencies, it just hasn't gone anywhere. Where there is, a key push, it really does make the difference. But conversely, I think you also need the skills and resources within the agency to be able to pick up and run with it as well. And that's another thing we hear, which is really, with these directives coming down, there's sort of pushback from, sort of the mid-level and junior level around, this is another requirement. This is more, we don't have the skills, we don't have the resources to enact some of this, we don't have the funding either. So it's really about getting both of those things right is really critical. And I think we're seeing, particularly I think New South Wales, and Transport for New South Wales is doing a fantastic job with this. And I'm sure there are other agencies as well across Australia, but I don't happen to be working with them. So that's probably the two things. And I think lastly, national consistency as well. So taking some of that great work that's happening at a state level and adopting it nationally, like the INSW work that Catherine mentioned. So you don't have multiple people having to duplicate and do the same thing.
Totally right. I think they're trying to do that, right? The infrastructure bodies. So Lewis, in terms, with your advisory hat on, where can you see sort of companies going in this learning process? Have you got some good examples that you can share from around the world?
Well, speaking of sort of international applicability, PAS 2080 is applicable anywhere. As we're seeing, and different types of projects as well. So I've applied it to the British Antarctic Survey infrastructure modernization programs, so Antarctic, China, Rwanda, anywhere. So firstly, internationally, it's applicable. In terms of, I was just trying to sort of distill all my thoughts over the last sort of 10 years into sort of what might be useful. For a couple of years, very recently, I was seconded into the Scottish Government to help them, I guess, get a grip on carbon on a big infrastructure program. It's 200 projects, £5 billion capital investment, 10 to 15 years, and they wanted to try and work out how to align it with net zero, how to do these sort of things. And the key to that was PAS 2080. So I wrote some guidance that linked it all together. And that was really key, because that signaled, it's been said so many times already today, but leadership is so important from the top, and the ultimate top is the government, really. And then organizations will more easily sort of get in line. There's a subtlety about PAS 2080 about accreditation. As an organization, and companies can become accredited to PAS 2080. That is explained in PAS 2080, and WSP is UK is accredited to PAS 2080. I think Australia is very nearly there as well. But as you can see in the Infrastructure New South Wales guidance, it sort of says it's not absolutely necessary. I mean, try and work towards it. It'll benefit your own company as well. As helping to decarbonize things. So it's slow uptake, I would say, still in the UK for companies, but it does provide benefits to the company, but it's not absolutely necessary. There's a phrase that's sometimes used and abused here in the UK, which is using the principles of PAS 2080. Seems to watch out for that.
Yes,
People just saying we're using the principles, and it doesn't really make much sense. But if we're all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet, it does improve things.
So in terms of that question around the skills and resourcing that sort of Nick mentioned, how would you recommend people go about getting upskilled in the PAS 2080?
Lewis runs a great training program.
Yeah, I was just thinking, how do I mention
Goodness
that?
me.
Yeah.
That's a Dorothy Dixer.
Well, you know, I without advertising that training course, but I put that training course together 4 years ago because I realized that there's a gap here. I don't just mean a gap in the market to make money, but a gap because people need to understand what the hell PAS 2080 is, how to actually ask for it, and how to respond to it. So there's a course there. There's lots of stuff through the Institution of Civil Engineers. If you go to the ICE website, there's lots of bits and pieces on PAS 2080 there. And again, sort of, this isn't a plug, but again, recognition of a gap. There's a new course coming out through Thomas Telford Training and ICE on carbon infrastructure procurement, which is actually something we haven't touched upon too much today. But if you follow the thread of PAS 2080 and all this stuff, right, you measure it consistently, you're setting targets, how the hell do you make it actually have teeth and make it work? And that's procurement and contracts. So that's an emerging area.
Very, very important. Fantastic. So maybe Catherine, over to you. What have been some of your key learnings?
I'm probably going to labor the point there. And sorry for doing that, but everything just been said in terms of the final sentence of Lewis for us is the key learning. Because you need to create an environment that is a win-win for everyone. Unfortunately, we may think that managing carbon is a win-win. We don't need incentive because this is critical for the future of the planet. Having said that, in a business environment, we need to have incentives in place. So it's one thing to mandate. It's another thing to work collaboratively through the supply chain. And I'm not just talking about the organization government, but us as a key client for subcontractors. We need to make it work for everyone. So as everyone gets on the journey and gets some financial rewards, we're thinking incentives. So if we look into some of the contract model we have here in Australia, I'm thinking alliances in particular, where there's some rewards attached to a certain level of performance. Carbon has to be part of it. That's probably one of the key learning. And we've been talking a lot about that, but this is really critical to elevate this as the same level of expectation in terms of performance. I'm just going to mention something else. And this is a learning we've had for the Mallorca island, which is what it's called, the Green Island. So it's a small island on the Spanish part of Spain. And they've been on this journey of using hydrogen to power the island. The way they've approached that, so Acciona is part of this journey, the way they've approached that is a scalable thing. So it's not saying, okay, tomorrow we're going to go bang, bang, and suddenly we will have achieved what we want to achieve, a completely decarbonized island. No, it's a stage approach. And this example is a good one, I believe, because it's quite contained. It's an island. And I was talking with Louis previously to say, hey, I understand in Scotland, they're also considering doing this sort of approach for a groupment of islands. So there's an element of scale and scalable approach, which I think is very important as a learning as well.
Right. Okay, so we're going to soon go into the Q&A session. So sort of final wrap up for our discussion. So, you know, for adoption of PAS 2080 in Australia, what do you think are the biggest opportunities? And Nick, I'm going to start with you.
I think probably just the fact that it will allow for continuous management of carbon on our projects. So it'll keep organisations and government honest with their targets and commitments to net zero. Ultimately, I think if we can get to the point where we start introducing carbon budgets, both at sort of a project level, but also aggregated up into, you know, an agency level or sector level, you can start really making better decisions around, you know, where we should be spending our carbon budget the same way we, you know, allocate a cost budget.
Indeed. Evan?
Yeah, I think really like we've heard a lot today about the importance of like leadership, I think, and like upfront thinking. And that's really driven by, I think, by specification. So I think particularly like clients and governments learning about what's available in the supply chain before they even go out to tender. We've seen a lot of examples at with them kind of reaching down a couple of tiers and finding out what are the innovations, what kind of can be done, and then they can put it in. And the specification really drives it through the whole procurement model, like for the contractor, then the subcontractors and the material providers as well. So really that like upfront thinking, like the largest level of carbon reductions, or if you think about it like upfront and early, not as an afterthought at the end. And that allows it to kind of get budgeted in, I guess, and tended the whole way through it. It's got less chance of kind of being stripped out, I think.
Absolutely. It's one of the things, key insights I feel as if we've learnt out of MECLA is the importance of that early engagement across the supply chain with those, you know, the suppliers and contractors being able to have those pre-competitive conversations will make a big difference to the carbon outcomes. Catherine, what do you see as the big opportunity?
I see an opportunity in brownfield infrastructure. So because when you start from the very start of a project, then it's probably easier to understand establish your carbon budget. But when we start touching existing infrastructure, expansions or things like that, there's an opportunity to make them passive or self-offsetting by working a bit beyond what the scope is. And we've got a concept to describe that. We call it regenerative infrastructure. So not only there's mechanisms for new project, but if there's an opportunity to make this infrastructure carbon positive, that could offset an exit. So I think that's something we really need to push for when we are involved into brownfield project in opposition with greenfield project.
Yes, a regenerative infrastructure. I think nature positive is another sort of topic for another webinar to be really looking at how we do the climate and nature piece at the same time, because the nature piece will contribute to the climate and carbon piece. And Lewis, what sort of do you see as the biggest opportunities? Yeah.
I think when you apply PAS 2080, the thinking beyond just the project level, so therefore at a governmental level, at a system level, you'll discover it is the key to net zero, because it's a consistent way of adding up whole life carbon of everything that happens. In simple terms, you can add it up consistently. And then if you do that, it will point you towards the circular economy and the sustainability of resources and all sorts of other side benefits.
Okay, thanks, Lewis. So we got a bit of time for answering some of these questions. So we had someone, Saeed Charani, curious to hear your thoughts on the challenges and opportunities in uplifting the industry emissions sustainability baselines in the short and long term. We did have a bit of a discussion on baselines. Who'd like to tackle that question? Nick, I'm looking at you.
Probably better off one of the experts on carbon baselining, probably.
I think I'll jump in a bit. Yeah, no,
All
feel
right.
free to add to it. Like, well, I think it's a complex piece, and particularly for like concrete. Been working on it for a while, trying to look to do small work for MECLA as well. Is like, I think it really depends on like what you're doing and where you're doing it. Like, I guess the aim of baselines is really to do like reductions. It's not to gamify or anything. And the aim should be across all things, like to reduce the level of embodied carbon. So some applications might be really challenging, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything in this application because it's like a really high impact. Like we should all aim to try to reduce as much as possible for all the different kind of applications. They all have different kind of baselines, and I think that will be like $1 million question that we're still talking about in 20 years, of like what's the baseline for different types of, say, for concrete, different regions and kind of applications and stuff. But I think sometimes I just look to the EPDs leads because that's an absolute number. That's the actual number that we're talking about. The baselines will always change depending on the kind of the context, I guess, of what you're looking at as well. But the absolute number never changes.
Catherine, do you have any insights you want to share?
I was actually looking at the next question.
Oh yeah, you've got to answer that. The best practice guidelines for asset operators to reduce carbon for maintenance, which are sometimes 2 to 3 times upfront carbon. What levers asset owners can pull to ensure similar or better carbon reductions achieved during the operational construction stage?
I think I've kind of touched on it when I mentioned brownfield projects. So there's 2 elements. Future asset owners, they need to really integrate the all of life of their assets. And it sounds common sense, but unfortunately, this is not really what we see, because you always have this tension between CapEx and OpEx. So there's a willingness to minimize CapEx, which can drive an OpEx. And if I include the carbon bill into this balance, then it's kind of even worse. So future assets on it, I think with the baselining, with the carbon budget, we will get there. For people who are current asset owners, and it's limited impact. Let's say it. So there, and this is a very long-term view, but there will be a need for regulating stranded assets to understand how we manage that in the carbon equation. That's probably a government question.
Well, we're starting to see sort of MECLA membership expanding into the finance sector as asset owners, banking and finance start to go, they're waking up to why having embodied carbon included is a good sort of business proposition, but also a good quality asset for them to own. Yeah, so question for you, Lewis. What are the specific benefits for an organisation to become PAS 2080 certified rather than just aligning with PAS 2080?
I think ultimately you'll be more likely to get work in a simple, if I was to boil it down, it's a bare essence.
Crude, but anyway, yeah.
Well, why not? Because it'll show that you're demonstrating that you're nimble, you're agile, you understand PAS 2080. However, it's probably also important to note that again, the Infrastructure New South Wales guidance says this. It's the same in the UK. Everyone kind of recognises it's actually a bit tricky to get accredited to PAS 2080, like full on. Even if you've got all the systems in place, it's getting hold of an auditor that can actually come and do it. There's a sort of lack of auditors, there's a lack of auditing experience. That's something that the ICE has recognised, and there's a bit of market research happening at the moment as I speak to look at the number of auditors, the global coverage, and to try and raise that game. So you may not get accredited right now, but alignment is not quite the gold standard, but it's no bad thing at the moment. But ultimately, it should help your business.
All right. And then the final question, from a practical perspective, one of the key issues measuring carbon post-construction, particularly when the material changes during construction that are not captured. So we can put a lot of thought into the design phase, but the concern of AWIPS is making this real post-construction. Who'd like to tackle that question?
I'll probably start it. I think someone.
Okay.
Well, I mean, for current certifications, like there's design certification for Green Star and also Infrastructure Sustainability Council, but that really doesn't count. Like you actually have to go on to the as-built. So I think if things have been taken out between the design phase, you ultimately won't get the certification. It's not in the final, like for the final as-built. It's like the build materials, and you have to kind of prove that actually kind of went forward. So I'm not sure how that would go. What are your thoughts, Lewis, for under PAS 2080 here?
Sorry, you caught me off guard there, and the question's disappeared.
Yeah.
What was the
I guess
question
it
again?
was
Sorry.
like, does it help kind of ensure that like it carries the way through from the design to the as-built? Is there a verification of like this?
If you change construction materials as well.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, well, just to add to what was just said there, again, from UK experience, in applying PAS 2080, or I guess like whole life carbon thinking, I feel like we've started at the wrong end. We've started by pointing at the contractors and saying, right, we've decided to build a thing, we've designed it, right, can you make it low carbon, please? And there's only a certain amount that contractors can do. It should have been done earlier on in the process. But in terms of actually operational, that's really, I guess, fossil fuels involved in running the thing, which are measurable, I guess. Most of the embodied carbon's already been spent, and I can't really add anything more intelligent than what Evan has said.
I think with this as well, like getting that as-built reporting is quite important, because then it can feed back into the sort of benchmarks the next time around, the next time these projects happen. So it's sort of important for that continuous improvement.
Yes. And Nick, you know, in Australia, we've had lots of debate and discussion over the years around putting a price on carbon.
Yeah.
And as an economist, fellow economist, by the way, do you think we can achieve genuine net zero without actually really pricing carbon? And what are you seeing as infrastructure projects? Are they putting their own internal price on carbon?
Yeah, I think we probably just have to forget pricing carbon at the moment anyway. Just politically, you know, it didn't work out too well last time. I don't think either political parties are moving towards it anytime soon. But, you know, we've seen some alternate sort of mechanisms. So safeguard mechanism is a great example. It does cover reasonably substantial part of our emissions, I think it's about 28%. And even the best overseas EU carbon markets are only around about 40%. So it's not too much there's a bit of a difference there, but not massive. But there's also a range of other, mechanisms that the Australian government's putting in place. We've seen in the infrastructure, the carbon valuation work that I mentioned previously. That's pretty significant across, transport, infrastructure, and energy sectors as well. And from my experience, we're starting to really see that trickle through into the public infrastructure assessments when we're doing business cases, we're doing economic appraisals. It's starting to become more common practice that it is included. With all of that, how far does that get us? It's hard to tell, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to reach our net zero targets. I think we're seeing in the UK, they've sort of done the easy part, and they're starting to get in the more challenging, more costly to abate emissions, and you're starting to see pushback from government and the public as well around its cost. So, it's a bit difficult at this stage to see how far our current policies will get us, but I think we're sort of heading on the right track, but more needs to be done.
Indeed. So we might call that a wrap. So Nick, Lewis, Catherine, Evan, thank you very much for your time today. It was very insightful. Any questions that came through, we'll definitely be able to be in touch with you. We'll share all those recordings. And if you have some additional questions, please do get in touch with the various speakers. Keep an eye out on your inbox for the recording. So WSP have another webinar coming up, Energy in Transition, on the 19th of November. So I think there's going to be some information put into the chat there. And finally, we'd really be grateful if you could take a few moments to provide some feedback via a survey that we're going to pop up on the screen. Otherwise, thank you very much. Thank you, Lewis, for getting up so early to share your insights with us. We look forward to seeing you again. And thanks, everybody. And goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.